people do forget what a huge, huge star he was. He was the biggest thing in show business.
Daniel Patrick Carroll was born in 1927 in Cork, Ireland, the youngest of 5 children. His father died of tuberculosis when Danny was 18 months old, and his mother moved the family to London in 1937 to find work, settling in the heart of Soho.
I think Danny felt very at home as a young lad there, because they were from all over the world. People came to Soho. It was like a sort of melting pot. It was a very cosmopolitan place.
Not only was Soho cosmopolitan, it was also the centre of London's theatre land.
They had a flat in Earnshaw Street, and from his bedroom window he said he could see the Palace Theatre, and he used to see all the twinkling lights, and he used to say to his mum, "My name's going to be up there one day," and she'd say, "Oh, just be quiet, behave yourself."
Danny's mother, Mary Ann, was a strong woman and an inspiration to her son throughout his life.
His mother was a very significant figure with him. He always felt that she was watching him. He had a bit of a thing about it. It was always used to fascinate me, that. And he would always tell people that that I adored her. I actually never met her, but this is one of Dan's things.
The Catholic Church had a profound influence on the young Daniel, who went to weekly mass at St. Patrick's in Soho Square and attended the school attached to it.
Even today you can walk through Soho and there's old shopkeepers and that there say, "Oh, I will remember Danny when he was an altar boy."
I think if you'd asked him then when he was 11, 12, he'd have told you that he was destined to go into the priesthood. I think he loved, quite frankly, all the theatre of it, unsurprisingly.
That's the very first time he got dressed up. Was I think they were doing a pantomime, and I think the priestess said to him, "Irish priest, you're very good-looking young boy. You can play Cinderella," and then 2 of the other boys played the Ugly Sisters. I think it was the first time Dan ever dressed up.
At some point he wanted to be a priest, but his mum felt that she didn't want him to go that way. And she said, "My son is going to have a much bigger pulpit." And she was right.
When war broke out, the family were evacuated to Devon, where Danny found employment as a window dresser in Exeter, before deciding to join the Navy in 1943 and enrolling in the Combined Services Entertainment Corps.
He was in the Navy, and his first performance, apparently, in drag, was in a play called White Cargo, and he played Tom DeLeo, the native girl in it. That would have been worth seeing, I think.
For many servicemen, entertaining fellow troops in the concert party was their first taste of treading the boards, and some were keen to continue after they returned home.
So when the war was over, they all came back. There was a flood of these sort of chaps looking for work, and there was a number of these shows where they were all in drag.
I remember seeing these shows at the Croydon Empire with my gran, and she thought they were marvellous, all these old queens camping about there, She said, "So marvellous, they look just like women, Oh, it's terrific."
And there was a show called Soldiers in Skirts, and we went to see that show because it was so funny, and Danny was in it and was absolutely stunning, stunningly beautiful.
After a few years of touring provincial theatres, Danny grew tired of life in the chorus line and returned briefly to window dressing in London.
Most of those chaps went back to doing whatever they did, accountants or whatever it was. But of course, Danny went on to become a really big star.
In 1954, celebrated female impersonator and club promoter Ted Gatty, who had spotted Danny in Soldiers in Skirts, coaxed him back on stage. Danny's first solo engagement was in one of Gatti's shows, in a tiny club off Leicester Square.
The highlight of the show at most of these clubs is the striptease.
It was called the Irving Theatre, and it was a strip joint, really. And they needed some comedy, you know, you can't have strippers coming on one after the other. And he went down and sort of auditioned. He said, I got that job, you know. His name, of course, was Danny Carroll. And he said, but they've changed my name, love. You'll never guess what I'm going to be called. He said, Danny LaRue. I said, oh, my God. And he said, oh, for 25 quid a week, they can call me what they like.
Now, listen, kids, that was no way to start. Going on and on about me dress as a tart. I think of all the things you could have said instead. The supply's more than ample.
For example,
who is really rather nice?
Who is generous to a fool?
Who is sugar? Who is spice?
Armed only with his new name, a few wigs and a box full of frocks, Danny LaRue set out to take London's West End by storm.
Keep the show from rusting.
Always see into it.
All the jokes are just disgusting.
Who is what I'm trusting? True and true.
Tell me straight, please.
And a lovely little
Who?
You, Mr. LaRue.
It was the late 1950s and London's nightlife was booming. After years of post-war austerity, people had money to spend and were determined to enjoy themselves. Nightclubs sprang up all over the West End, where people could drink and be entertained into the early hours of the morning.
We were all in the clubs. There were probably about 12 or 15, you know. There was Winston's, Churchill's, Edmundo Ross's, Murray's Club, the Stork Club, all with shows of some sort, you know.
There'd probably be 2 shows a night, one at 10 and one at probably 1 o'clock in the morning. There was a small orchestra. You'd have some showgirls, some young ladies sitting around, you know, waiting for someone to buy them a bottle of champagne. And they were very upmarket.
Well, you had to have at least 5 guineas in your pocket because it was an event. In those days, if you were going to a club, people dressed. People had, you know, a cocktail frock and their best diamante jewellery and a stole. If you had a first stole, that was it.
The London nightclub scene suited Danny LaRue perfectly, and he quickly established himself as one of the most popular acts in the West End, performing nightly in a club called Winston's.
With Danny, there was Danny and Ronnie Corbett and Ronnie's wife, Anne Hart, and myself, and Barbara Windsor, Tony Palmer. All people who were in the West End doing a show would do a show in cabaret. It wasn't the National Theatre, but by goodness me, we had more fun.
I'd never been in a proper London nightclub. I was absolutely fascinated by it. It was a whole new milieu. It wasn't a theatre, it wasn't anything. It was and some very interesting faces in the audience. Ronnie and Reggie used to come to Winston's. Need I say more?
It was the place to go. They were very cosy. They weren't like clubs are now, huge, get as many in as you can. They were very, very cosy and intimate. And if we weren't careful, we knocked all the drinks off the tables.
But the reason people queued round the block to get into Winston's was Danny himself, delighting the audience with glamorous frocks, towering wigs, and a stream of innuendo.
Lovely and wanted by everybody.
He looked so real. I mean, because when I worked with him, he was very young and at the height of his prettiness. Because he was actually pretty, which sounds strange, but he really was a wonderful figure.
We present the 7th edition of our cabaret, devised and produced by Danny LaRue, written by Barry Cryer, with additional numbers by Bill Solly.
The material was basically filth. But no language. It was all double entendre.
Good evening, Lady Cynthia.
Hello.
May I call you Lady Cynthia?
Any time, dear. Grosvenor 4328. If Mother answers, don't hang up. You're still on a good thing.
Dan was very prudish. He never swore. I never heard Dan swear, and he certainly wouldn't have countenanced any language in the show at all. No, it was all double entendre and innuendo and topical as well. A lot of topicality.
What do you think of Michael Foot?
A wild exaggeration.
Well, first of all, let's talk about Ted Heath.
And people do, you know. Yes,
We played all the great characters in history, so he was Josephine to my Napoleon, and, he was Margot Fonteyn to my Nureyev. So this naturally funny contrasted sizes, that I was the rather very seriously masculine one, whoever it was, and Dan was this tall, statuesque beauty.
And when I was a very small boy...
You grow out of it.
In the Caucasian foothills, singing and dancing.
In
the Fernia. One day, I leaped over the fence.
Preparation and leap.
I leaped over the fence and was caught by the Cossacks.
Oh, my goodness.
Let Ronnie be funny, let Barry Cryer be funny, let Tony Palmer be funny. I mean, whoever was in it, he gave them their bits. It wasn't all Danny LaRue, but it was his show. And any star who has any clout always does that, because you still stand out.
Come to me, my little sugar plum.
Sugar plum's a fairy.
Any question?
However convincing the performance, Danny was at pains to ensure the audience knew it was being played for laughs, and he wasn't seriously trying to emulate a woman.
What I've always tried to do, I think, which has helped me a lot in my particular approach to this female impersonation, is the balance of the two, is trying to never lose yourself. The thing that used to worry me is sort of this terrible thing about, oh, is it for real, you know?
Danny hated the word drag. He said, I'm a man in a frock. It's a joke.
He would come on looking unbelievable and then say, watch your mates.
Watch your mate.
To let the audience know he's a man. Just to make sure that the public... Because women thought it was a woman, and men would think it was a woman.
What is this gorgeous, glamorous street, Fanny?
What does it mean, this flattery sweet, Fanny?
It made the fellas in the audience feel quite comfortable. They go, it's really a man, it's all right.
There's more to you than meets the eye.
Frankly, they're considerably less.
And it made the ladies feel comfortable too, because they didn't have to sit there thinking, my God, that's better looking than me. What am I going to do tomorrow, dye my hair blonde? I mean, it was good business. It made everybody comfortable.
Just where you're sitting, not as pretty as you, but this lady, she looked at me and she said, tell me, Mr. LaRue, do you enjoy dressing up like a lady? I said, not very much, love, do you?
He was obsessed with coming on as himself at the end. He didn't want to, still be in the dresses at the end. No, he'd got to be there as himself.
Making it clear that underneath the frock was a strapping 6-foot man who was only dressing up as a joke was a necessary device in the 1960s.
Danny, for a long time, didn't come out overtly at all. In fact, he liked to create the impression that there was, carrying on with the girls in the show, and my wife, among others, would be his arm candy at some premiere and everything. It was a horrible era. It was like sexual McCarthyism. They were haunted, hunted people.
You know Danny LaRue, don't you? He's got this wife in Ireland and about 8 kids he's got over there, and he's butch as hell and all that. And what are you supposed to say? He said, is he really? And I used to say, yes. Of course I did.
There was no hypocrisy in their not coming out. They'd have been ruined and probably gone to prison. I mean, it's awful looking back at that era.
Danny had met his manager and long-term partner, Jack Hansen, after leaving the Navy in 1947. To the outside world, theirs was simply a working relationship, but friends and those they trusted knew differently.
Jack was a wonderfully steadying influence on Danny, because I don't believe Danny ever thought he would get the fame and fortune that he did, because it wasn't, as I say, it wasn't heard of for somebody to make a career out of dressing up as a woman. It was not heard of.
Jack looked after Danny's business, and he was terribly good at it. And so Danny just had to perform and be a star. And Jack used to negotiate all the contracts and make the investments and look after the money and all of that, and did it beautifully.
In 1964, under Jack's supervision, Danny bought a small premises in the corner of Hanover Square and proudly opened his own club, Danny LaRue's.
Danny's club was, I suppose, an overnight success, but it became the thing, the place, absolutely the place. There's never been an explosion in a nightclub since that was as big as his.
Quarter of an hour, please. Quarter of an hour, please. Very well.
I'm ready. We just had one dressing room. We all stood in a row in this one dressing, boys and girls together, and Danny had a little cupboard just at the side. And what he did in that cupboard was nobody's business.
Douglas, you are late.
We never get any bright lights.
Never comes in here usually.
The bawdiness and the nudity and everything going on in the dressing room, it was just joyful.
We started at 1:15 in the morning, supposedly, if Danny was ready, which he never was. And we were supposed to do 1 hour. Well, if we ever came off before 2:45, 3 o'clock, it was a miracle, because once he was on there, you couldn't get him off.
Look, I have a query, but you can't bring him in here.
Buzzing. There was a buzz about it. And the audience would go, it's like the Ivy. I wonder who's going to be there tonight.
You couldn't get in, and every night there was, a Streisand or a Nuria for a Princess Margaret, or a Noel Coward or a Judy Garland, and Liza Minnelli when she was 16. Just everybody came,
I once found myself singing the trolley song with Liza Minnelli on one side and her mother on the other, Judy Garland, and I thought, what's going on here? And I looked, and there they were, going clang, 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 went the trolley. And when we finished, Judy said, it's a good thing we all sing in the same key, isn't it? And that's what happened in that place. You never knew what was going to happen. I loved it. If it was on now, I'd still do it.
Another regular visitor to the club was the fun-loving Princess Margaret, who struck up an unlikely friendship with Danny.
A favourite anecdote of mine that he told me was an encounter with Princess Margaret. And not only did she come to the club, but, they were good enough friends that Danny got invited to Clarence House, where she lived. And she was drinking quite heavily at one stage, which most of us might, have thought but not have said anything about. Not Danny. He said that you ought to lay off the booze. At which point she slapped him round the face and threw him out of the room. Danny promptly then turned round, walked back into the room, slapped her round the face, said, don't you ever talk to me like that again, turned on his heel and left. Anyway, they might never have seen each other again, but after a few weeks, Princess Margaret came back into the club, and the first thing she said to him was, am I forgiven, Danny?
Cup of tea, 2 lumps.
Oh, my God, you're madly attractive.
You're just attractive yourself in that gown. As they say in Paris, you're quelque chose.
Does it?
By the end of the 60s, Danny LaRue's fame was spreading far beyond the confines of his club as he landed starring roles in TV specials and West End musicals.
Listen here, my dear two-timer. You've been telling folks that I'm a real pushover for your flattery.
A real pushover for your flattery.
Well, it's my duty to...
As Danny prepared to wave goodbye to a sophisticated metropolitan audience and take his unusual act to the seaside, there were fears he might not be to everyone's taste.
She's not what she seems to be.
He was engaged to play his first ever summer season. Now, that was thought of as being a big breakthrough because Danny was going to leave the rather cosy atmosphere of the West End, the coterie of the Zsa people, and go to Margate, to the Winter Gardens of all places, and do twice nightly summer season with every mums and dads and kids from the beach. And everybody thought, now, will this work? Will they understand? Will they appreciate?
You're tremendous, you're stupendous. What a hero, what a laugh. You're a super-duper trooper. You're my mate, my better half.
But we did fabulous business and a fabulous success. And that was the breakthrough of Danny as being a huge general public favourite.
But as Danny LaRue moved into the big time, disaster was waiting in the wings.
Daddy LaRue, Daddy LaRue, Daddy LaRue.
By the end of the 60s, Danny LaRue's audience was growing.
What's your mates?
No longer the property of the London elite, he was touring the country and packing theatres wherever he went.
Looking at faces that smile at me, from the stalls to the balcony.
As Danny's fame grew, so of course he was put in bigger and bigger shows, you know. He'd do a summer season that would last for months and months, or he'd do a pantomime that was still running at Easter.
People do forget what a huge, huge star he was.
Cambridge Circus, London, the Palace Theatre, and a show that played for 2 years to packed audiences every night.
In 1970, Danny returned to the West End in triumph, headlining in his own show at the Palace on Shaftesbury Avenue, the same theatre he had gazed at from his bedroom window as a child.
We said, we have got a superstar here. Let's dress it up and make it as big as we possibly can. And there was nothing like it anywhere else in the world. There's nothing like it in Paris and nothing like it in Las Vegas, because this was Danny LaRue.
Having heard that Roy Hudd, a comedian he admired, was struggling to find work, Danny offered him a leading role in his show at the Palace.
He took me from the lowest I've ever been in show business to pushing me right up there again. He was so kind, and he insisted, Danny, that I had my name up in lights alongside his, and he was the biggest thing in show business.
It had sketches and it had songs, so it was like a variety bill, really. It was a complete extension of the nightclub show.
Well, here we are then, back in Soho. I love Soho, don't you? I have relations in Soho. I'm not saying who with.
Danny loved music hall, and he loved the intimacy of talking to an audience, which he described himself as a Max Miller in sequence. It was seaside postcard material, and it was the interplay between him and the audience.
It's all right, girls, I know what you've been thinking all night. My God, where does he put it?
Every eye in that audience went to his meat and two veg, or where it should have been, you know, and you could not see a bump.
Well, I'll let you all into a secret. Do you know, I've been doing this act so long, I whistle, it goes away on its own, like that.
What an opening. And from that moment on, he got them. Because if you can, as a comedian, anticipate what your audience are thinking, you've cracked it. And Dan was great at that.
Stop all this talk about sex.
And lose my living.
Sex is a pain in the neck.
He must be doing it wrong.
It was a very middle-aged and elderly audience. I would say 70% women. And they laughed so much that actually after the matinees sometimes they had to go round with the hairdryers because the seats were wet. They used to pee themselves laughing. And that's, people don't believe that, but I promise you it's true, because Danny came round one day into my room and said, "Here, Tone, guess what? They're out with the hairdryers."
But when the curtain came down on the show, the evening was far from over.
Danny loved people going backstage afterwards with a glass of champagne. Would you like champagne? And the stage doorkeepers would go, when are we going to go home? And he entertained in his dressing room. His dressing room was his living room, and he loved that.
It was almost like another show, doing another show after the show, because, you know, again, he'd be so full of energy.
My God, did he have parties? I mean, he would have 3 rooms. He'd have one room for his costumes. He'd have a dressing room where he got made up and all of that, and then he would have a reception room. So there'd be maybe 15 to 20 people in the reception room and waiting and chatting amongst each other, and then suddenly the door would open and in would come Danny. See? I mean, when he walked in, you know that a star had walked into the room, you know. Very demanding, very theatrical.
He didn't drink before the show, but he was known to consume a little, more than would fill Cinderella's slipper after the performance.
Sturm.
And when that happened, he could become a little difficult. I have many cases in point where the phone has rung in my flat at 2 o'clock in the morning with Danny on the line saying, the sound wasn't very good and you've got to sort it out.
He loved his champagne. And when he was in his cups, he loved nothing better than to talk about himself. I mean, I did beautifully. Did you notice the way I did that? Wasn't that wonderful?
Ich liebe dich.
Dan had a wonderful naked ego that was almost a shared joke with you, like tongue-in-cheek. 40 years in my profession, and all this used to go on. Anybody who questioned his status, any interview or anything, though, oh, they got it. They got the rave from the eyes.
He was quite grand, yes. If he didn't think he was being paid the respect that was due in restaurants and things, he used to get very stroppy. But then he'd always been grand. Even when he had sixpence in his pocket, he was quite grand. But I think a lot of people who become big stars, it's no good running about being humble, is it? Doesn't really get you anywhere.
When it came to television, Danny LaRue's act worked best on variety shows, such as The Good Old Days, where he was able to perform on a stage and interact with a live audience.
Watch your mates! Jolly good luck to the girl who loves a soldier. Girls, have you been there?
And I think Dan is one of the people that television sort of peeps at, really, peeps at him working at his best, has a look into his world. I don't think Danny ever went into the world of television. I think television went into his world.
He never did a lot on television because he always said that the comics go on television, they give their act away, and that's it.
As he approached his 50s, Danny began to realise that his days of dressing up as a desirable woman were numbered.
I feel, I'm rapidly approaching middle age, as they say, and I feel that all my birds, as I call them, become friends, and I want to be as gracious to them as they've been to me. I'm going to hang them up nicely.
Yes, but the show that you're in is booking well and well and well ahead, so there's a lot of insurance policy, time-wise, so that if you do change your mind...
No, I don't. The reason that I'm where I am is I don't change. I always plan my life, and I know what I want to do. I have other things to do, and I feel the time to finish the bird part of my life, the glamorous birds. I think it's time for them to be finished on a glamorous level.
Yeah.
With the money he'd made from both his club and the theatre tours, Danny had invested in property, buying a large house in Henley and a riverside hotel in the village of Streatley, Berkshire.
I think he just loved beautiful things, and obviously he reached a point where he didn't just have to look at them, he could own them.
Well, what is the full extent of the LaRue empire here, Dan?
Oh my God, the empire. Well, we're coming into it now. So here, just here, we're starting the little island there. It goes right round, right down there to the pub, as you see, with the lovely Streatley hills behind, which is glorious.
Once he'd bought a property and done whatever he wanted to do or furnished it, he was on to the next one. He never sat and really enjoyed what he had. That always puzzled me a bit.
Come alongside.
Oh, look what's waiting on the side.
That's what we call Irish hospitality.
Danny lived an expensive lifestyle, hosting lavish parties and enjoying spending his money on those around him.
Dan was generous with himself and with his money. Very generous man. Even in his pantomimes, dressing room door always open. Champagne and everything.
Too generous. Too generous. Generous to a fault. His mum had a very good saying. If he had 2 sweets, he gave them both away.
He somehow got to know of a place called Walton Hall, a hotel, a huge great pile in Warwickshire. And any sensible person would have said, look, Danny, you can't be a big star all the time and have your dibs on Walton Hall. It's a full-time occupation.
I couldn't see it having a future unless Danny was there entertaining every night. But then, because he was away so often. The place got into a certain amount of difficulty, and then Danny decided he couldn't run it properly.
With mounting debts, in March 1983, Danny put Walton Hall up for sale, but was approached by two Canadian businessmen who persuaded him that, rather than sell it, he should go into partnership with them and let them take over the day-to-day running of the hotel.
I can remember him saying to me, well, they've been. And this meant these Canadian businessmen who were going to be sort of like the lifesaver at Walton Hall. And he said to me, today, Jack and I have signed a contract with these people, and it's either the best day or the worst day of my life. Let's hope it's the best.
And I said to him, what business are they in? Oh, he said, I don't know. I said, oh. Oh, he said, but Jack will know. I said, but why don't you know?
These two Canadians were con men, and they ran up bills for flowers, cars, planes, entertainment, everything, all in Danny's name because the deeds had never passed over. And finally, when it was discovered, Danny was in debt up to here.
It so bankrupted Danny just before his 55th birthday in the early 80s. He had to get rid of everything, including the house in Henley. So all that wealth, all that work came to naught because of those two men.
Everything was going into receivership and everything was going very, very wrong. And the public thought that he was in the wrong, and he was determined that he would just continue as though it was business as usual.
In answer to a journalist who said, where's your God now, Mr. LaRue? He said, he took my money, not my talent.
He went out, he did the town halls, he did everything, just to pay back all the people who he owed. And I thought that was the most wonderful thing.
Now in his mid-50s, with everything he'd worked for in tatters, Danny LaRue faced the daunting prospect of having to start all over again. It was 1984, and having been cheated out of his entire fortune, Danny LaRue was millions of pounds in debt. To make matters worse, Danny opened in the title role of a West End revival of the musical Hello, Dolly, and received a mauling by the critics.
He did Hello, Dolly, and he was the first man to ever play Dolly Levi. And I and a lot of people thought it was great, and the critics hated it. They absolutely slated it, and it closed.
Well, Hello, Dolly was going a step too far. He did it beautifully, but I always remember Lionel Jeffries saying at that moment when he had to get down on his knees and say, "Marry me, Dolly," it just wasn't going to work.
It was an absolutely thundering flop.
Look at the old girl now.
Jack Tinker in the Daily Mail wrote that Danny was like a jockey without a horse. It obviously did hurt, but I think a bit of him also would have thought, oh, well, they're all wrong. You know, I was fabulous. I was absolutely fabulous.
Looking to boost flagging morale, Danny's manager and partner, Jack Hansen, decided the time was right to take the act to Australia and New Zealand.
What's your mate?
Countries where Danny had been successful on previous tours.
But it's good to be here. Frankly, I feel right at home. No need to wonder why I'm in song. I'm down under where I belong.
Danny wasn't only popular, of course, in Britain. His fame spread, and most particularly to Australasia. So he did many successful tours down under in Australia and New Zealand. The
tour had just arrived in New Zealand when tragedy struck. Jack Hansen collapsed at a welcome party held in their honour, suffering a massive brain hemorrhage. He died 2 days later.
Daddy was devastated. I mean, we just fell to pieces immediately afterwards, but life has to go on. And being a performer, he had to go on and perform, whether he, you know, it doesn't matter what he felt like.
I think he missed Jack tremendously. I think there was nobody there to say no. And I think the only person that could say no to Danny was Jack.
Well, it affected Danny very profoundly indeed, and perhaps unsurprisingly, he took to the booze. And, you know, he was still able to perform, but he'd come back afterwards to his dressing room. And on one occasion, he said it should have killed him. He drank 2 bottles of brandy.
Without Jack's guiding hand, Danny's future suddenly looked very uncertain.
In 1984, Jack Hansen said, I think Dan has 5 good years, 1984. And then he said he could retire, and then he can always do a lovely pantomime at Christmas time, come back as the legendary Daniel LaRue. He doesn't necessarily have to put all the bums on the seats. And that was the plan that Jack had, and of course it all went wrong.
Because he was determined to clear the remaining debt, Danny continued to appear in a string of pantomimes and toured countless small theatres as he moved into his 60s.
He was of an age then where he, you know, he should have been thinking more about hanging his bra up than having to work. But he had to work right to the end to make a living.
I used to say, you know, Dan, you should be sitting there in some lovely place, I said, with a, you know, glass of champagne and all that, reminiscing and telling all these things. You shouldn't be out there camping about this. It's ridiculous.
And what do I end up with? Squalor, the most sought-after lady in the land. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?
He'd filled Blackpool Opera House in a long summer season. They don't exist anymore, those long seasons. And the next time Danny went to Blackpool, it was the South Pier. And he's in a van, driven by the devoted Annie with the frocks in the back of the van. You know, it's a cruel world.
We're doing quite a lot of tours, yeah. We do like a spring tour and I don't know, various, you know, but a lot of one-nighters, which was pretty gruelling.
He was playing some smallish theatre. The impresario who was presenting him went into the dressing room while he was, just before he went on, and Danny said, what's the business like, you know? And he said, it's only half full. He said, I didn't want to hear that. He said, well, you asked me what the business was like. He said, I'm telling you, it's half full. He said, if you say that once more, I'm going home.
The audiences and venues may have shrunk, but as far as Danny was concerned, it was business as usual.
Even though we were travelling, he'd still have guests backstage, and you're trying to pack up and pour champagne at the same time, you know, but that's all right.
It was quite amazing, and I've seen it with other artists who have not done too well at the end of their career. They seem to be able to blot it out. And I'm sure, you know, he was sad that things had gone the way they did, but he never showed it.
I always used to be amazed by this, the way he would carry on as though it was all happening as big as it ever did. He could walk onto the stage of a very small theatre with creaking boards and terrible conditions. He thought he was at the London Palladium.
As he approached his 70th birthday, Danny found himself a new companion.
He said, this is my only friend now. I've his friend I can trust, Jonty. When I come home at night, he's always there, and he gives me a lovely look, and we sit and we have a glass of champagne together. Don't we, Jonty? And he said, of course, you know it's Jack, don't you? And I said, no, I didn't know that, actually. Oh, yes, he said, that's Jack. And I thought, well, I don't ever remember Jack Hansen looking quite like the dog, but Danny, if you say it's Jack, it's Jack.
He played Theatre Royal Plymouth in pantomime. And he walked up and he walked through the stage door with John T. And the stage door keeper said, "I'm sorry, Mr. LaRue, but dogs aren't allowed backstage." He went, "No dog, no Dan."
As the years passed, Danny began to spend increasing amounts of time at the home of Annie Galbraith, his costume designer.
He was a sweetheart. I mean, there's no two ways about it. As I say, you know, we used to have our differences and this, but he was great company.
In 2006, Danny suffered a stroke. It brought to an end a performing career that had spanned well over half a century.
Towards the end, Dan became quite wistful and reflective and philosophical, and terrible trouble with eyesight and all sorts of health problems. And the devoted Annie was just, she hijacked him and said, "You're coming to live with me in Tunbridge Wells." It was just what he needed at that time. We used to talk on the phone a lot. And he was very wistful. All the old lovable bombast and all that had gone. It was a very quiet voice spoke to you on the phone. And I thought, boy, you've been through the mill. You really have been through it.
After a short battle with cancer, Danny LaRue died on the 31st of May, 2009.
I just sat holding his hand and just said, you know, how wonderful to have known him and to have been there, you know. And I said, you're now going to meet up with all those wonderful friends that have gone before you. And I said, I'll never, ever, ever forget you.
In 2010, at the Brick Lane Music Hall in East London, scene of Danny's final performance in a frock, some of his vast wardrobe of costumes took to the stage one last time. Danny had agreed with Annie that after his death, his collection of frocks should be auctioned, the proceeds providing her with a reward for years of loyal service.
Can I start the bidding for £100? 150? Yes, sold, 150.
The auction was a great success, attracting bids from as far afield as New Zealand and Japan.
Sold 375, number 121.
It was a fitting tribute to a truly remarkable performer.
On Mother Kelly's doorstep, down Paradise Road.
Noel Coward once said, "White has style, Paris has style, Danny LaRue has style." And that's what he had.
He was the only person I've ever met in show business who absolutely loved being a star. He loved every minute of it.
On Mother Kelly's doorstep, down Paradise Road. All together now, on Mother Kelly's doorstep.
He was the glamour that I remember from my youth, that's gone from the West End. He was part of that wonderful glamorous thing. I could see him whizzing up the corridor with wonderful perfume going by. Wonderful clothes. Oh, pretty picture. A happy picture to remember.